Welcome back to our discussion, Federal Insights, Secure Identity and Access Management, sponsored by Octa and Amazon Web Services here on Federal News Network. My guest today is Sean Frazier. He's the Federal Chief Security Officer at Octa. I'm your moderator, Tom Temin. And Sean, we've been talking about cloud-hosted services, cloud-hosted Active Directory, and the need for a cloud platform for access management, ID management. And we should talk about the cloud providers themselves, because often they have among their list of 10,000 possible services you can order from them, services related to cybersecurity, to log on, to ID management. So discuss maybe the need for removing friction from your agency's process by using what the clouds themselves offer as commercial entities.
Well, I think, Tom, it's been widely understood that cloud provides value in the sense that it provides scalable infrastructure very quickly. So, for example, if you're deploying an application, you need 100 servers literally overnight. Who better than Amazon to deliver that capability to you very agilely and very cost effectively? And it also is a matter of kind of managing your costs, right? Do I go buy a bunch of servers and hire a bunch of people, or do I just do an operating expense and write one check every month? So it's been kind of widely understood, those benefits of cloud. I think the one that's not as well understood, but I think is equally, if not more important, is the security aspects of cloud and picking a provider who is really focused on security. And Amazon's a great partner of ours in this sense, and that, you know, when servers have to get patched, and they always do, or software has to get patched, and it always does. I mean, who's on the hook to actually do that and be responsible for that? So if you're an organization or an agency and you've got 1,000 servers in your data center, you got to hire a bunch of people just to manage those. And sometimes they're sitting around, but sometimes their hair's on fire because the patches come out. All servers have to be patched. They can't be patched during business hours, so everyone's working overnight and weekends. Or another good example is I got a pandemic happens and I got to scale up my infrastructure, but then I have to make sure that's all done securely. Again, that's another hair on fire moment. So the benefit of cloud providers, they've already kind of built in and automated all of this capability, including the patching and security infrastructure for what they deliver. So it allows organizations and agencies to focus on what they do for a living, which is their users and their data. So they're not spending a ton of money on racking servers and plugging them in and scanning them and patching them and updating it. So it kind of removes a large amount of kind of resources and dollars that they've got to spend in order to deliver that service, because they're giving it to somebody who kind of does that better and does that for a living across the board.
All right. And I wanted to ask you about a related issue, and that is ID proofing, because we talked earlier about the PIV process and the CAC card process and how we're at an inflection point to be able to allow people generally, whether highly secure jobs or ordinary federal jobs, to become provisioned and join the organization remotely if they can't do it in person. And that's where ID proofing often comes in. And there are a lot of third-party proofing services that have data and elements that the agency itself may not possess, but are nevertheless legitimate legally to use as ID proofing people. And we've all encountered these in private life. So how do they fit into the picture, and how can they get incorporated into cloud-hosted platforms for ID management and enrolling people?
Yeah, they're a very important part of this, because that's kind of the front door to get users in the system in order to trust that element of that user as they come in. And we talked about the smart card and the physicality of proofing, where you have to go kind of sit in front of somebody and sign a paper, and then they give you a card. And that's still valid. There are still proofing mechanisms that look like that. But as we look at, again, back to the kind of the pandemic in the last couple of years, when no one could go into an office and get a card or do anything physical, there have to be other mechanisms to do that. And it kind of splits between two lines. One is kind of the corporate line of I can force a little more rigor on the corporate side. Then I got the citizen side. So for example, if I'm dealing with citizens or customer facing stuff, I can't necessarily make all my customers come to a building and fill out a form and then give them a credential. I've got to be able to do that online. So we partner with a lot of great organizations that deliver this capability. LexisNexis is one of them. We've actually done quite a few implementations in the States to protect Department of Labor data. Obviously, another very key element, key importance during the pandemic is folks had to apply for unemployment benefits and wanted to make sure they could do that securely and make sure their identities could be protected and make sure that they could actually onboard and proof those identities securely as well. So it's a very important part of the aspect. I talked earlier about how NIST was smart to kind of separate the two things out. So you've got the IALs for proofing, and you've got the AALs for authentication, because they can happen at different levels depending on the use case. So you might be able to online proof somebody at an IAL2, for example, and then you may still require strong authentication in an AAL3, and you have the flexibility to kind of mix and match.
Yeah, so for agencies that are offering these types of publicly facing services, such as were famously offered by the trillions through the various pandemic response legislation pieces and appropriations, we're now coming to account for some of the fraud that happened in those cases and some of the just simply unworthy individuals. And their ID proofing as something offered to the public. And we haven't really talked about public users or, the constituents outside of contractors or federal employees. And so it seems like cloud hosted proofing there would really be useful. And probably we can point to some agencies that have already done that. For example, if you sign up for My Social Security or for Medicare, these elements come into play when you try to sign up as an individual so that no one else can take your identity. Maybe comment on how they fit into the whole cloud hosting type of setup.
Absolutely. And I would say that if you're not doing it in the cloud, you again are going to struggle with this because you're going to have to build these monumental systems at this large scale. And you're going to have to keep that in perpetuity because you don't know how often you're going to have to prove people, how many people are going to come in at the same time. It's much easier to work with a cloud service provider who can kind of scale up and down based upon your requirements versus you having to kind of figure all that out on your own. And there are a lot of good organizations to do that. And you mentioned that, that a lot of fraud happened on the front end of the pandemic. And I can't fault anyone for kind of moving fast to try to provide unemployed people their benefits because that's exactly what we should have done. But obviously the next go around, where if we have any kind of events where folks are required to do this from home, we've learned our lesson, right? And we got to put that protection on the front end. So we are preventing fraud because the attackers, wherever there's money on the internet, that's where the attackers go. I mean, the attackers run a business, just like businesses run businesses, where they go where the money is, they get the low hanging fruit. It turns out that identity and access management is kind of low hanging fruit. If you don't use those protections we talked about in the earlier segment, you're not using multi-factor authentication, you're not using secure single sign-on. That's pretty low hanging fruit for these attackers. And they'll keep attacking that vector until we stop them because there's no reason for them to stop because it's still pretty easy.
And so what are some good practices for preventing phishing attacks from having success? Because they're getting more and more sophisticated. And if you're after IDs and credentials, phishing seems to be the most important vector for getting those, as opposed to someone hacking into a cloud server and taking, although that happens too. But what about the phishing aspect?
Yeah, I think if you look at any given statistic that's happened over the last handful of years, kind of phishing, social engineering of getting someone's credentials ends up being like 80–85% of the threat vector, right? So and the reason it continues to stay high is, again, we haven't made it hard for attackers to not do it. We haven't created enough attacker friction on those things. So phishing is an interesting one. You have to kind of handle it with a very much a belt and suspenders approach for security. You've got to do a few different things. First thing you do is you enable multi-factor authentication. If you can do phishing resistant protection, so phishing resistant would be a FIDO or a FIDO2 token. So it might be a hardware token that's utilized. That creates a little bit of user friction because people like my mom have a hard time using a YubiKey, unfortunately. But that's the high bar of security for the end users. And I think that, as long as you're doing the multi-factor authentication and again, can apply those single sign-on constructs, you also have to do end user education. And the reality is we tell people not to click on links, but the internet's full of links, right? We all get emails with links in them. You can't tell users not to click on links, but what you can do is you can educate them so that if they have clicked on a link and inadvertently, there's a mechanism by which they can notify somebody, either, if they're a consumer or customer, give them a big red button that they can click on saying, hey, I accidentally clicked on this link. I thought it was you. I hear, my credential might be compromised. Same thing in the enterprise. Make sure that you have a robust security program where users feel empowered, users feel like they're part of it, so they can report that and they don't get shamed into thinking, oh, I clicked on that link, I don't want to tell anybody because that would look bad for me. Make it an open experience so they can tell people, because the reality is there are links out there. We can do all these mitigations. Mitigations are great, and that will protect us from most of them. But part of it is involving users into the security conversation too.
And getting back to the ID management question in the minute we have, maybe just give us some of the places to go for standards and references to be able to design systems that are contemporary and up to date and meet federal standards.
So I think there are a few things, and I would also point to some places to go with regards to zero trust security, because I think identity and access management isn't something that stands alone by itself necessarily. It's part of this bigger security story, this bigger security kind of mindset shift we've had over the last several years. So obviously, NIST has a few different places I would go to for information. So certainly 63-3 is something that I always look at. I would look at what NIST has done around zero trust. So 800-207, that's another great document. There is an NCCOE building block that's been spun up over the last couple of weeks. That's an adjunct to 207. I would pay attention to that. I would also look at some of the guidance that's come out really pretty recently from CISA and OMB and other places around zero trust and identity and access management. As a matter of fact, CISA just released their zero trust maturity model. They just released their cloud security guide, which is a really, really good guide, very holistic approach to cloud security. So I would encourage folks to, if you haven't signed up for the CISA alerts, please do, because they're putting out a lot of good information.
All right. Well, thank you for a very action and information-packed conversation. Sean Frazier is the Federal Chief Security Officer at Octa. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to Federal News Network. For more on this discussion, please visit federalnewsnetwork.com and search Octa.